I need to tell those who weren't here before is I am not Bruce Douglas.
Really?
Bruce has been laid low by a stomach virus, which is apparently endemic, or at least epidemic right now, because we've also got a couple of other teachers for the kids and so on who are after this thing. So Allison asked if I would try to lead a discussion on 3/4 of the story, and hopefully I'm going to get in touch with Bruce. He does want to come back and do the last session.
Good.
I'd kind of like to hear how the story comes out. We're going to try for next week, but I don't know. I haven't had a chance to get in touch with Bruce directly, so I don't know what his schedule is. But maybe I'll try to get something up on the website or whatever. But you can check next week. I hope he can be here next week. But if not, we'll look for some time to bring him back to do this last session. I'm going to recap quickly because it kills some time. But I think we'll find plenty to talk about. This class is called Rethinking Secularization, and Bruce said in the first or second session that that's an interesting title because that suggests that we all thought at one time we understood secularization. And he described briefly the history of that. I mean, there's been secularism since at least the Renaissance in one form or another. I used to call it humanism. You may remember a few years ago, certain of the Christian fundamentalist groups got quite upset on what they called secular humanism. And there were active campaigns against secular humanism, and sometimes simply shortened to humanism. There was a fairly powerful movement for centuries called Christian humanism. They didn't refer to that one much. I'm not sure they liked that idea. But in any case, secularism is not really a new thing. But in particularly beginning the 18th century, the Enlightenment, it began to become a little bit more of an organized system of thought, if I can put it that way, with people like such as David Hume, the great Scottish Enlightenment thinker, and many others, writing works that, although they didn't describe themselves that way, would be seen today as arguing in favor of a secular approach to the world. Because they saw religion, at least they saw much of religion, as more or less equated with superstition. And with the scientific revolution and then the Enlightenment, there was a growing feeling that we didn't need that stuff anymore. Now we know that it isn't evil spirits that make you sick, it's germs or bad diet or things like this. We know that God doesn't move the planets around. There are physical laws that are responsible for that. And of course, great author of those physical laws that pretty much dominated scientific thinking for 2.5 centuries was Isaac Newton, who was also an alchemist. And Isaac Newton wrote more than once that the purpose of his scientific researches was to prove the limits of man's knowledge, because beyond that was God's domain. Newton was not in any way a secularist, but his thought led to the growth of this secular tradition. And then beginning, I guess, in the late 19th century, people began to write self-consciously about secularism, and there grew up something that Bruce calls secularization theory, which in a nutshell is that the more modern you get, the more secular you get, which means the less religious you get. And essentially, we aren't going to need it as we get more modern. And that seemed to have a certain amount of validity, except for the United States, which, as Bruce frequently pointed out, is an outlier. In Western Europe, certainly, particularly post-World War II, there was a very sharp drop in religious activity of pretty much all kinds. I mean, there were certainly theologians writing in Western Europe, some of them very influential. I don't know that there were as many theologians in Western Europe who was influential outside the religious world as there were in this country. In the 60s, really in the middle third of the 20th century, people like Reinhold Niebuhr, Paul Tillich, Martin Buber, the Jewish, I mean, these people were public intellectuals. They weren't just writing for Jews and Christians and so on. They were widely read. When I was in college, all of these people were on reading lists in classes that did not have anything particularly to do, or maybe not Tillich, but the others would have been in classes that really didn't have much to do with religion. They were not religious studies classes. But people read Niebuhr in foreign policy classes, people read Buber in literature classes. Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit, who was like largely forgotten today, was read by scientists and so on. It was a huge explosion. And it's almost as if somebody flipped a switch, beginning in about 1970. And if those of you who were at the 8:30 service this morning saw one example of that. Attendance in churches plummeted. People who identified themselves as religious dropped off, particularly those who identified themselves as a particular religion, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Jewish, whatever. That just sank a lot. And it was, again, even more pronounced in Western Europe. So this seemed like it was proving the secularization thesis, as Bruce calls it. Modernity equals secularization. Finally, we're done with religion. Don't need that anymore. And we can now move on. Religion as a crutch, we don't need that crutch anymore. So, the United States has remained stubbornly out of that pattern, however. There certainly was a drop in mainstream Protestantism and to a lesser extent in Catholicism beginning in the 70s. But there was also that very marked growth in the so-called Bible churches, in certain kinds of Pentecostal evangelical things, and partly through immigration, largely through immigration, but there was also a growth in this country in other religions, Islam, Buddhism, and so on. The one, I meant to ask Bruce this, but I forgot last week. I don't know what the situation is with Mormonism. I would be curious to know about that, because at least 10, 12 years ago, Mormonism was not subject to that same trend as the rest of the established religions. And I would be curious about that, but that's kind of a side issue. So that brings us down to his last week when he talked about the stubborn refusal of the United States. By most measures, the most modern society, at least the most modern large society in the world, but we simply have not conformed to that secularization theory. We're not getting, religion is going down somewhat in the U.S., but nothing like what would be expected according to the theory. And in the rest of the world, Africa, Asia, the religion is in fact not conforming to that. As China has modernized, as Africa has modernized. Now, Africa is not where the United States or Western Europe is yet. But as Africa has modernized, religion has not particularly disappeared. In fact, it's become, sometimes disturbingly so, a much more obvious force in the society. And I would say that what's happening in Africa might, in fact, bolster some of the arguments of secularists as to the bad influence of religion. You can, and for the last month or so, in any given day, Muslims and Christians are busily killing each other in Nigeria, for example. And it's pretty clearly based around their religious identity. It'd be another class on whether this is really a religious war, because these are also different tribes, different languages, different lifestyles, agricultural versus, so on. Nonetheless, they identify themselves as Muslims and Christians, and if you're a Muslim, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to drive you out of my town. If you're a Christian, we're going to either convert you or kill you. And, that isn't the picture of religion most of us feel very comfortable with, but it's the picture of religion that an awful lot of particularly secularist critics of religion keep in mind when they talk about how modernity has got to lead to a cessation of this.
That sounds like one of the things that Bruce brought up as to sort of the genesis or the beginning of this secularization movement in Europe with the Reformation and with other conflicts, with, especially in religious in the religious realm. That's why it was sort of trying to tone down the religion and become more modern.
Well, the 30 Years' War, which is a war that most of us studied for 5 minutes back in college, was, in a way, it's a great, I think, failure, frankly, in the historical education that goes on, because the 30 Years' War was an absolute watershed in the history of Europe. They slaughtered each other without let up for 30 years, hence the name. And the effects of that on Europe. Now, it wasn't the first time. The 100 Years' War was not actually for 100 years. It was war here and there, but it was also fairly devastating to Europe. But with a handful of exceptions, the 100 Years' War's effects were felt most keenly by the nobles and knights fighting it, and by the peasants unfortunate enough to be in the immediate vicinity. The 30 Years' War just devastated Europe. It depopulated parts of Europe. And when the thing was finally over, it was like, guys, we cannot do that again. I mean, that's just not going to be good. Part of this was the rise of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, we got another problem here we need to pay some attention to. And we can't be slaughtering each other. So it didn't put an end to religious conflict by any means, but it certainly tended to dampen it down. And one way it did that, beginning with the Peace of Westphalia, was it pushed, this was the beginning, in some ways, of the separation of church and state. We got to get politics away from religion. Now again, you can say, well, the 30 Years' War, it was about Catholics and Protestants, yes. It was also about mercantilistic northern German princes who didn't want to be given money to an agricultural southern society, and we still see a little of that today. So it wasn't as if these people were slaughtering each other because of the difference of opinion about whether communion constitutes transubstantiation or not. You know, but there was in fact some of that. In any case, religion became, if nothing else, an excuse for this war. And it certainly gave people who had some skepticism about whether religion is overall good for humanity a lot to argue with. In any case, that happened in Western Europe. That one part of secularization theory, I guess they could say, I don't know that they do say this, once the Africans have slaughtered each other long enough, they'll get to that point too. And they'll see that they've got to put this religious stuff aside so they can get on with life. The Muslim world has not had, despite a actually longer schism within the Muslim world between Shiites and Sunnis than has existed between Catholics, because that began a generation and a half after the death of Muhammad. So that's gone on for a long time. And yet they have not yet at least come to some sort of, we don't like each other, but we've got to at least live with each other and trade with each other. So, you know, I don't know that that's, I don't know enough about Muslim history to speak authoritatively on that at all, but at least it seems relatively obvious now that, I mean, certainly part of what goes on in the Middle East is a Shiite-Sunni struggle. That's a basic to what's happening there. And sure, it's about power, but it's about power religiously identified. Again, a secular argument. Well, so that brings us down to last week when we talked about modernity. A couple of people made the point, I think Bruce made the point too from his outline. Maybe what, there isn't, Bruce rejects, as must have been clear, secularization theory in its classic form. Modernity equals, you know, the death of religion. And he made the argument that what modernity brings, in fact, is pluralism. It brings a variety of choices. It brings the realization that there's a variety of choices out there. Part of this is just sociological change. When you grow up in a community where, and this, you know, this is more recent in our past than a lot of people realize. When you grow up in a community where everybody farms, and maybe 10% of the population that does not make its living through farming, where everybody is the same color, speaks the same language, and goes to one of 3 or 4 of the same churches. You know, it's not that maybe anybody forces you to go to the Lutheran church or the Catholic church in your little farming town in, like, say, Lake Wobegon, but those are your choices. And nobody's going to sit down and say, yeah, let me talk to you about Buddhism. I mean, it doesn't happen. And it's not doesn't happen because it's necessarily being repressed. It just isn't there. You know? When you've got 3 TV channels, you take a look at what's available, and you know something is. It was called by one sociologist the least objectionable program. And that's what you will watch. Now that you've got 380, it's probably still the least objectionable, but at least you've got a wider range of choice than you had. And part of that's urbanization. You move out of, you know, how are you going to keep them down on the farm and so on. It changes. TV changed it. The radio changed it. More than, again, railroads and radio were huge, huge social engines in their day. And we tend to forget that a little bit. It's one reason there's so many songs written by Southerners about people. I mean, this is literally, people lived and never went more than 20 miles from where they were born and raised. In much of the South, in part because the road network in the South wasn't very good. The terrain was tough. For 3 months of the year, you can't move because of mud. And you know and then they built railroads, and now people could move around, get their goods to market. It was a huge social force. And now, of course, we've got that in spades. Debbie mentioned the iPhone in her sermon this morning. That's made a pretty significant change in the availability of information. So the whole range of choices is much greater. And Bruce's point, I think, was that secularism didn't sort of plan on that. And that has led to a number of things. One of those is the spiritual but not religious, or the nuns, N-O-N-E, the people who feel somehow, who will identify themselves as religious, and in this country in particular, will identify themselves as believing in some kind of a divine being and in praying daily. What was that statistic? I think he said it was 60% of Americans claim that they pray daily. 46% of Americans think that angels are an active force in their lives. So, but 60% pray daily, and that's well, probably maybe 12 times as high as you get in Western Europe. And I wonder if you asked that question in Western Europe and did not ask the Muslims, because if you throw in the Muslim population, which in some countries now approaches 10-15%, of course, they will say yes. But if you ask people who come from Christian backgrounds, I don't think you'd get, I'd be surprised if you break 10% that pray daily. So we were looking at that a little bit last week, and one of the points that Bruce made, and other people from the group made too, churches in Western Europe are different. It is interesting to me that despite this decline in Western Europe's active participation in religion, you still get important religious developments occurring in Europe. There are Western European theologians who are influential. At least at certain junctures, church figures become influential. Archbishop of Canterbury, the Pope, would be two big ones, but there are others. And at least two movements that have been influential. Now, these are not contemporary movements. They go back a few years, but the Taizé community that Emily is quite devoted to, and the Iona community in Scotland, these are pretty active, and they're globally active. There are still Christian missionaries leaving Europe. They tend no longer to be going out to save souls. They tend to be doing, good works, is what we call it. Like the sort of Doctors Without Borders is not religiously affiliated, but a number of the people in it are religious. Things like that. And at least I don't know the source for this, but Bruce said that even in Western Europe, scientists who, pretty modern people, right? They created modernity in some ways. Scientists in Western Europe are kind of split between believers and non-believers. It's not like just because the guy built the CERN Collider or something like that, he is therefore non-religious. Some are, some are not. So that's an interesting and an interesting development which does not support the secularization thesis. One way to support that thesis is to say, well, we're not there yet. And that's, of course, you can pretty much always say that. So that's what the communists were saying. That's what dictators. So we're moving towards democracy, but we're not ready yet. Okay, that's one explanation, but perhaps not entirely satisfactory. Now, I want to raise just a few questions that I'll just kind of put them all out there, and then we can. Bruce defined secularism as worldliness, and he was specific about that more than once. And he defined worldliness as, quoting Bonhoeffer, as living your life as if there were no God. That is, you may go to church on Sunday and you may do the thing, but the rest of your life you live it as if there were no God. Weber, another favorite of Bruce's, talked about in the 19th century that we are moving into a disenchanted world. There isn't mystery anymore. There are things we don't know yet, but we don't see them as mysteries. We see them as problems we haven't solved yet. And that's a different thing. That's a just completely different thing, in fact. And Weber is most famous for some of his other sociological stuff, but that's a fairly, that is more than fairly, that is a dramatic change in the way people think about their relationship to the world. I'm not arguing for a return to superstition here, but when you begin to think that whatever is out there is a problem to be solved, rather than a mystery that we will not understand, you have a different point of view about your whole life. I have a very close friend who was at one time a devout Episcopalian, and is now a fairly militant atheist for a variety of reasons. But the one question that he kind of doesn't like to get into, we get into these things now and then, is, you know, the Big Bang Theory and so on, but there has to be some kind of an origin. At least in my view, there has to be some kind of an origin. And if you believe that everything is a problem that can be solved, that one's a pretty hard problem to solve. Gary Pinder, former pastor, told a story in a sermon, a joke in a sermon one time, and I'll boil it down, but what it boils down is scientists have now been able to create life in the laboratory, and so a group of scientists think, now we can do this, you know, we can kind of take it from here. So they go to God and they say, you know, you can take a rest now, because we got it now. We can do this. We can create life from just dirt. So God says, well, it sounds like, you know, taking a vacation wouldn't be a bad thing, but I want to make sure that things are running okay. So let's just do a little try. So let me see you do your thing. So the scientists say, okay, they get their equipment together, they scoop up some dirt, and then God says, you got to create your own dirt. So, but that kind of encapsulates this issue of dealing with origins. So the question, one of the questions that occurred to me then is, if we take that definition of secularism as worldliness, what exactly would it mean to live life as if God mattered outside Sunday morning? I mean, to me, that's a huge question. Another question that occurs, we talked about this a little bit, maybe a little bit less cosmic, is the difference in this country we have sort of a free market in religion. Bruce used that term. And in Europe, they have state churches. And even though there are other churches in most European countries, I think it's all European countries, there is a state church, and you pay taxes to it, and it changes the way you think about the church. I think very fundamental. And so that even the churches that aren't state churches, which in England, for example, would be Anglican and Church of Scotland, in Italy would be the Catholic Church, the other churches exist, but the fact that there is a state church, I think, still tends to change the way everybody thinks about the church. And that isn't true in this country. It's also not true in some, at least, of the African and Asian, well, as far as I know, it's true in all the Asian countries except the Muslims. So at least there's some sort of competition. People feel like there's not that, you know, I'm telling you to do this kind of quality to the church. Now, interestingly, to me, very interesting, Bruce made the point that some people now in Europe are beginning to push against what he called dogmatic secularity. It's like, don't tell me not to be religious. You know, people don't like to be told what to do. And even Jürgen Habermas, who is an eloquent proponent of secularism, has written critically of this whole dogmatic secularism thing. So that, to me, that's a kind of interesting, you know, the nature of the church, how much does that really affect us? And kind of from does modernization actually, does it lead to secularity? Or does it just lead to choice? Now, another sociological explanation of that, and would explain what's going on in Asia and Africa right now, the growth in religions. Modernization is profoundly dislocating. We've all we grew up in the modern world, so we don't. But I mean, modernization is profoundly dislocating. It changes the way people make their living. It changes where they live. It changes how they interact with their parents. I mean, there was a time when you had to be very careful about telling your father to stuff it, because it was his farm, and if you were going to succeed, that farm had to be your farm someday. Otherwise, you're in very serious economic trouble. That's just not true anymore. That hasn't been true for, and you know, that ceased to, it was never entirely true, but it was a lot truer in 1700 than it was by 1850 even. So that changes the way everything happens. You know, we come up with a scientific thing, you know, birth control, that changes the whole nature of sexuality. I mean, all of these things are just, so that dislocation makes a lot of people really, really uncomfortable. And they begin to look, they react against it. They begin to look for something to help them through that dislocation. And this is the sociological, That's something for some people's religion. So when you begin this process of modernization, you may get a spike in religiosity because people are upset, they're worried. It's the same way that churches were fuller the week after 9/11 than they were the week before it. Mm-hmm. People are upset, they're looking for something. Now that brings us to another point Bruce made last year, is that Christian Smith has said that people are meaning-seeking beings. And secularization, he says, is a devotion to the mundane. So I guess the last question, is there a non-religious alternative to this devotion to the mundane? That is it possible to seek meaning outside of a religious framework in a way that is otherwise effectively religious? This is perhaps not as clear as it might be, but the idea that there is something larger than ourselves, something, can you genuinely create that realization without recourse to some kind of a religious framework? I think that's a pretty critical question, because I think Christian Smith is right. I mean, it has been tried. Communism, after all, was exactly that. But I think few of us in this room would have ever argued, and probably even fewer communists would argue today, that worked out well. And so, so can it be done? So, there's some questions. I'd like to start with that idea of what would, if we presumably we're in this room today because we call ourselves Christians. So what do we do on Tuesday to prove that? That would be, how do you live your life? How do you live your life as if God mattered? That would be the alternative to a secular approach to life. Now, Orthodox Jews have one way to do this. Orthodox Jews can't eat certain things. They have to wear certain clothing. They have, and the purpose of that, at least as explained to me by one of my close friends who is one of those very Orthodox Jews, it isn't that pork is somehow evil. You're not Jewish. Go ahead and eat pork. It is that following all these laws reminds us all the time, of our relationship to God. And that's the reason for all these laws. Now, I'm not sure every Jewish theologian would agree with him, but it's a persuasive argument. Does it make him a better person? No, and he would not claim it makes him a better person. It reminds him that he stands in a particular relationship to God, and that might make him a better person.
I always felt a little bit critical about Muslim 5 prayers in a day, at very set times and everything. And then I would stop and think, but they're praying 5 times a day. They're thinking about God.
It can get to be rote, it can get to be formulaic, it can get to be just kind of, let's check out.
But at least you stop what you're doing. Exactly. And for some, it's very inconvenient to stop what you're doing.
Well, we used to do that in the Christian tradition, and we called it the Sabbath.
Oh, there's still monks and nuns and stuff who pray
Sure.
the hours.
There are still some who do it.
Yeah.
But, the disappearance of the Sabbath, I think. I mean, one of the folks who was normally here stopped me on the, just say that she wasn't going to be able to be here today because she's got to go to a basketball game with her one of her grandkids, and they're driving out to Prussville to pick something up. So, okay, that isn't reminding you of God. Now, I'm not saying that we can or should go back to the Sabbath. Either way, we've had whole classes on that. Nonetheless, what do we do, that reminds ourselves? Because I think you're right, that praying 5 times a day, I mean, it has not escaped notice of a lot of scholars that those religions that are growing are the ones that say, I don't care how busy you are, this is what you do at this time. I don't care how busy you are. Don't tell me that. And we don't do that. So that's one, yeah.
Well, I guess 2 things. I'll try to be quick. Is one thing that I came across in my reading recently, and you all here probably know more about it than I do, but there's your spiritual development as a person. It might start out as, certainly for me, as God is a rock. I am a Christian. I am not leaving this rock. I was in the slippery slope. I grew up not being a Christian. I'm not losing this. And then after 20 years or so, you get more comfortable. And you're like, oh, well, okay, maybe things aren't as so clear as they were. And I learned this is a perfectly normal personal growth thing. And in theory, I've read about there are people who grow even more and they kind of come back around. And so you can say they're spiritual but not religious, or you could say they're spiritual but not rule bound. I'm not there. I'm tipping my toe in the chaos and then I'm going right back to my rock. I wear my cross every day, not to say I'm a Christian and you're not. I wear my cross every day to remind myself to whom I belong.
And that would be the analogy to that of the special garments that Orthodox Jews wear. You know, for example. I mean, that's, I think, you know, so one alternative to this, and there's, I think we've actually had a class on this, using, I can't remember the name of the book now. Something like The God of Small Things, but that's actually a novel by an Indian writer, but there's something like that.
There's a lot of
Anyway,
quotidian.
but you create personal
Christian,
rituals for
right.
yourself.
Right.
Okay, that might be one way to do it, like you're wearing of the cross. Maybe praying every day at a certain time, you know, even if it's just a few minutes. Grace before meals, things like that. Those are all things that at least remind us a little bit. I'm not sure that quite gets at what
But the
Bonhoeffer
spiritual
was talking
thing
about,
that,
of living life as if God mattered.
yeah,
but-
the thing is that presumably you can do everything for the glory of God. You can wash dishes and change
and
your
that was the point of
child's
this book that
diapers, and
I can't recall.
you can do everything for the glory of God,
Yeah.
in theory.
And
I'm
this
not
is
saying that.
in some monasteries. I mean, in some monasteries, that's exactly the point. You know, there are orders of monks that devote themselves to praying all day, but there are orders of monks who, well, when my wife and I were in graduate school, we had a good friend. We used to call her undercover nun. She was a nun. She was a member of a small order that originated in the Midwest. But the order to which she belongs, they never wore, or at least had not for a long time worn any sort of habit. You know, nuns' clothes. They didn't fly. And they were required to be entirely self-supporting, to have a profession. Her profession is professor. She's now a professor of Chinese literature. They were required to have a profession. So it's like, okay, Kathleen, how is this nun like? You know, and it was precisely because what you do for the glory of God. The one thing that there would be small communities of them. They would like run a house, and 5 of them would live together, and they had daily rituals of devotion. But like I said, it was an undercover nun thing, because if you were in her class, unless you asked or got to know her people, you would have no clue.
Yeah, there's a wartime expression that you'll never find an atheist in a foxhole. And I think one of the explanations for why we are an outlier is that we, discovering in some respects, we're living in a foxhole, in a war. I'll mention 3 dimensions of that. One's the environment. Deteriorating environmental conditions, man-made or whatever, are raising some very serious doubts about our ability to manage the planet responsibly, good stewardship. I think a lot of us are beginning to turn to God, particularly when we see torrential downpour, or flood, or drought descending upon us. A second example is, you mentioned science and technology as being mundane and the advances there. Yet, here we are at a point where the gun is being turned toward us in the sense of, this technology that we have available is still making our private information very vulnerable. For example, we're discovering we don't have much control. We could, when we talk about, I hear talk now about, is the capitalist model working? Does it need to be revisited?
Well, the income inequality and all that. Yeah.
Exactly. So there seems to be in the social arena and the environmental arena concerns that we don't have all the answers, and it's not mundane at all, but it's a real challenge. And we're not going to solve this on our own. We're going to have to turn to a higher
The question I would have
authority
about that, I think those currents are there. But how is that different from Western Europe? Most of the challenges that you have mentioned are equally faced by Western Europe, and in some cases, war not so much, but in other cases maybe more so. And yet, this religious identity does not seem to be recovering in Western Europe. So, so I think the reasons you give for are there, and yet it still doesn't explain entirely the difference between us and Western Europe. And we think of our Christianity as originating in the Holy Land, but in fact, the kind of Christianity that we all practice originated in Western Europe.
Yeah, but the burdens of power, if you will, we've been engaged in two military adventures that also show our limitations. Europeans have not. We're not that involved in those adventures.
With one or two exceptions, yeah, Britain.
True. I gather that in some respects, our European colleagues, which are much more advanced in environmental mitigation and in many ways in conservation, in terms of the vehicles they drive, in terms of recycling they do, etc.
The vehicles they drive, though, Philip, I think you need to be clear, that originally was not driven by environmental concerns. That was driven by financial. So they don't
Whatever the reason.
Well,
Sure.
Yeah.
And they've learned to deal with it strategically, where we sort of, because of our abundance, if you will, have been less concerned.
Isn't there a fundamental difference? Americans, we're just basically optimistic, can do, pull yourself up by the bootstraps people. And Europeans have been, annihilated in war after war. It wasn't just the 30 Years' War. The trenches of World War I and the horror of the Holocaust. And they're like, okay, God never intervened. There was no banner in the sky saying make peace.
I think one thing that's interesting
they're
about
just
that,
beaten
World
down.
War I, the aftermath of World War I actually led to an upturn in religious activity. That was part of what drove that
Like
religious
C.S.
explosion.
Lewis and those
But
guys.
World War II did not. It was a little bit different. But you're right about the scale of things. Statistically, I remember this from when I was in Scotland. The World War I there was something about this in the paper just recently. We don't think about it as a lot here in the U.S. In Scotland, statistically at least, every single family in Scotland lost a primary male relative in World War I. That is brother, father, husband, or son. Every single family lost one of those four in World War I. That leaves a mark that,
Could you just restate the question again? Because to me, as I
What would
hear the answers, it doesn't seem to.
Well, we're wandering a little bit, but the question, the main question, I guess, the two ones that strike me as the most interesting come out of this discussion. Okay, the first one is, if secularism is living your life as if God doesn't matter.
And just stop right there for a second, because that to me seems like a very personal thing. It's an individual thing. I don't know how we can take an answer to that and then apply it to an entire continent.
Well,
It just doesn't.
I guess Bonhoeffer's, and that's Bonhoeffer's description. Bonhoeffer, I think, would say that it is a personal decision, but if it's a personal decision that has no consequences visible to the rest of your community, it's a personal decision, doesn't mean very much. It is, generally speaking, not impossible to determine. Let me back off from that, because I just thought about my undercover nun friend, but if you know someone's life a little bit, then at least
The one way we could probably look at this beyond the personal, because the question itself is almost universally personal. Beyond that, there is what I would refer to as affiliative. You make it more so by your affiliation with what you claim to be, not in opposition of what you claim not to be. By that I mean you personally identify with a group. We would identify as Presbyterians, we would identify as church members, or we would identify with a particular mission. As opposed to, we are not like, say, those people who do not go to church or do not attend a service. And I think that more than anything else, if we want to be more than just, it's a personal thing and I do this for myself, that I think would be the bellwether that I think we as a group would have to adopt.
one of the differences between religion and spiritual, if you want to, very broad categories, is religion, almost by definition, involves some sense of belonging to a community. So it is an affiliation, and it's a communal. We can go and pray privately and all the rest of that, but we still, at least according to Christian understanding, we still need to gather and worship God together. I do think, though, Ron, it is fundamentally a personal question. So let's make it a personal question in this regard. Ask yourself, okay, what do I do during the rest of the week that I would not do if I weren't Christian? In other words, what difference? This comes out in the pulpit all the time, but it is, after all, perhaps one of the 2 or 3 fundamental questions involving your spiritual life. How does it? Because the whole idea of the Christian religion, at least, and I think most other religions, it is about transforming human beings. There was a time when there was a time when a lot of religions were about slaughtering a lamb so that the crops would be good. I mean, people believed, or at least professed to believe, there was some kind of direct correlation between what you did and what happened. But most of the world's great religions have never really preached that. In that sense, I mean, even in the Old Testament, that goes back a ways. And we have God telling the Jews in the Old Testament, I don't care, we lay down the rams and stuff. That isn't the point, people. The point is not you sacrifice a ram and then I'll be good to you. The point is you sacrifice a ram to remind yourself who you are and who I am, and then you go out and act like that matters. What is the fundamental, I think it was in the scriptures recently, what are we to do? It's pretty simple. But do we do it? Love the Lord your God. So how would your life, how would your life be different if you did not believe in God? That's maybe turn it around that way. Would it be that deep? You'd be able to sleep in on Sunday morning. Apart from that, what's going to be different?
Yeah, so...
I'm not going to answer this question today, I suspect.
But I don't feel like I'm a Christian because of something I did. I feel like I'm a Christian for something because of something Jesus did.
But he did that in part. It's transformative. I mean, if we want to go with what St. Paul said, everything old is made new.
Yeah.
Okay,
So live our lives in response to what Jesus did.
Exactly. Are you just passing it? Thanks a lot. I'm going to go do my. No, I don't think that's the intent here. Yes, we are saved by the grace of God, not because we picked the right ram to slaughter, but that should mean something other than just thanks. I'll drop a note and moving on. It has to mean something. I mean, I think that is pretty clear throughout the Christian traditions.
This is on a kind of a small scale, but when I first started the seminary, I had a classmate who said she did not want to put a Wesley Seminary bumper sticker on her car because she didn't want. She knew that she acted badly in traffic sometimes. She didn't want to reflect on the seminary.
Well, there's a transformation we can all wish for.
I know. So I really feel like I must enter into a conversion experience every time I turn on the ignition. And the other thing is, I read a few years ago of a woman in France who was she had a graduate degree in literature and could not get a job, and so she worked as a checkout person. And she wrote a book, something like Travails of a Cashier. And she was just very frank about how rude people were, how cruel people were, routinely coming through to cashier and thinking nothing of her or of her as a person. it became a bestseller, and I think it was even became a movie, and for a little while, people were nicer to parents. But I think of that, and I use it as a sermon illustration every now and then because it's so telling to me. And anybody can be nicer to anybody in public just because you want to be a nicer
Okay,
person. But does your faith inform
Yeah,
that?
and that sort of leads to a phrase we've all heard. If you attend many of these classes here, it's moralistic therapeutic deism. You know, is Christianity really nothing more than sort of doing good works? You know, the Doctors Without Borders, for example, is a remarkable organization, but it is not a Christian organization. There's a lot of people out there doing good things who aren't Christian, who aren't religious. You know, they're not Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or anything else. They just believe. Now, this kind of gets to the second question I think is the big question here. We talk about spiritual but not religious, you know. But what could, if you want to take that seriously for a while, I will admit to a prejudice against people who say, well, I'm spiritual, but to me it means, okay, you're lazy or you just don't, I mean, to me it tends to imply people, and I may be completely unfair here to some of them anyway, who haven't really thought much about this issue. They just kind of, I don't want to just say I don't believe in God, but I don't want any of the obligations that go with believing in God. That, to me, bluntly, is what I often hear when people say that. But assuming I'm wrong, what would it mean to be spiritual? I think we can agree that people can be religious without being spiritual. I mean, that's an example. But what would it mean if you take it seriously? Because Bruce was tending that way in his last lecture. He said, this is one of the answers to secularism. People who are spiritual but not religious are whatever else they may be, they are not secularist. And I think that's an important point.
Well, this is somewhat related, but I'm sure everyone, probably a lot of you read the article in the Washington Post about how many people are forming sort of Sunday morning congregations to get together because they want to be together and they want to sing and they want the ritual and they want to be able to mark occasions and have holidays, but they're basically atheistic. But they still, they still have that sort of urge to form these kinds of communities. Of course, it started in England, and they've already split between the group that wanted to be radically
organization brings
atheists.
choice.
Yeah, the group that wants to say our point is to be atheists and to promote atheism, and the other group that says we don't care, you can be atheist or not atheist, we just want to get together and have it not be founded on a certain set of beliefs. And I think that's sort of a development in religion. I don't think anybody goes up to someone who's Hindu and says, what do you believe? That's kind of what they are and how they grow up.
They reinvented being Unitarian.
Well, I think that I think Hindus and Buddhists, it's kind of like, here's this framework, you either participate in it or you don't. Where I think with us, it's this constant, do you believe? What do you believe?
If you want to talk about choice, though, Hinduism provides you with an awful lot of choice.
Well, that's right. That's right. They don't insist that you believe every day in a certain set of, there's a lot of flexibility in it. And I think,
I think part of what, and this gets such a little more, something I said earlier, part of what that comes down to, and again, Hinduism, if you are raised Hindu, you will be raised in one or another variety of Hinduism. All religions, it seems to me, try to, for a variety of reasons, now the sociologists of religion who are secularists would say it's because priests like to control things, and it's all social control, it's a self-perpetuating power elite, and so on. And it has been at times, and it still is. But if we want to just look at the doctrinally and take them at least some of the proponents of whatever religion you want to pick has meaning what they say. Part of what they are trying to teach believers is this comes with obligations. You have an obligation to God. Now, what that obligation is varies depending upon the religion. But it isn't just a question of getting together and feeling good. The religious approach for every religion that I'm familiar with, at least, is that you have an obligation to God because of.
we have an obligation to do certain things, but I think
No, you have
Christianity...
an obligation to God, to transform
To
your life.
God, okay, but I don't know that
To let your life be
any of the
transformed.
other major religions are quite as insistent as do you believe in your heart?
Islam?
No, I don't think that there's the emphasis. It's just
Oh,
this is who
no,
you
very
are.
much so. You gotta be careful about that because political Islam is a different deal, and that's what we tend to see through. The Quran says, in fact, explicitly, that no one should be forced to accept Islam. That's an explicit command. Now, do they follow it? Okay. I think we can probably find one or two things in the Bible where we wandered off the path too. But that is explicit in the Quran. Now, in the case of Buddhism and Hinduism, because of both of those have many, many subdivisions. But pick your subdivision, and I think you will find that there is something in there where they say, well, if you're going to be a Zen Buddhist, this is what, I mean, one thing that Buddhism is consistent about throughout, whichever group of Buddhists you choose to focus on, Buddhism is looking for a cessation of desire. I mean, that is the Buddhist approach, is the evils in the world are due to, human desires. And then what they do not mean that if we all stop having desires, there won't be any more tsunamis, for example, or disease. It won't matter. Because it won't matter. I mean, that is common throughout all strains of Buddhism. Does every person who visits a temple in Bangkok understand and believe that? Of course not. Just in the same, but I'm talking now at this stage of the fairly high theological side of it. All of them have some sense of, and I will tell you that Buddhism has plenty of obligations built into it.
Now, I'm not talking about no obligations. I'm just saying that they're not so insistent on you every day deciding what you believe. It's
I think
in different ways, I think that they are. I mean, a Buddhist would say that if you, they're not going to say, believe this or else. Well, actually, they do say it, because the point about Buddhism is that if you don't get it, you're going to come back as a frog, or you keep trying until there is a goal, and that goal is enlightenment. It varies from different groups of Buddhism, how you get there, how they understand it, and all the rest of that. But there is a goal, and there is a way to get to that goal. And if you don't follow the rules, if you will, you won't get to the goal.
the thing is, to come back to Christianity, is it's not about you have to do this or you have to follow the 613 rules in the Bible. It's about something else, a relationship with God or a transformation, or I don't know, I don't have the words, you guys are all smarter than me. But in the public sphere, it's come down to you believe that abortion's wrong and homosexuality is wrong, and in the public sphere, and
the litmus test theology.
right,
And I
that's what people who are spiritual but not religious are fighting against. They're saying, well, enough with that noise.
I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Mm-hmm.
The popular image of someone who is religious in this country is the popular image also, I think, is someone who is dogmatic,
That's the
inflexible,
word.
intolerant, and there are certainly
And
people who
Christianity
identify
is so
themselves
much
as
richer
religious,
than that. Yeah.
as religious who are like that. But I think you're right in that I think that it's one reason, I think, that people are, I was listening to Debbie's sermon this morning, and those of you who haven't yet been to church, part of her sermon is about your obligation to go out and invite people to hear the good news, to invite people specifically to come to this church, whatever, to be a witness. And I am probably not alone in this congregation telling you that I find that a very difficult concept. I would not know how to begin. I really, people ask me about my religion, I am more than happy to talk to them about it. I don't know how to initiate that conversation. I just don't.
As I'm reflecting on, I'm going back to the first question, really. So I'm reflecting on that more. I'm thinking, when I'm in my comfort zone, I'm sort of like those scientists in your humor. I say, okay, God, I got it now. I'm okay. You can go take a break. I'm good. When I'm feeling super confident, but when I'm outside my comfort zone, when things are falling apart, or when I'm expected to do things I've never done before and I have no idea how to do it, get bad. I'm asking for help.
Now, one of the, I think that is a universal experience among, at least among people who are religious. And to some extent, when people who aren't religious and find themselves confronted with a huge crisis, the foxhole analogy. But that also, if I were a secularist, I would say, well, yeah, sure, you need a crutch. So when you need a crutch, you turn to religion. When you don't need a crutch, what that demonstrates to me as a secularist is that it is a crutch, you just got to get over it. Gary?
Looking back, a lot of people thought Lincoln and Jefferson were not very religious, but it seems to me they were very spiritual in the terms you're talking about today, and they were not religious in terms of outside manifestations of that. And that seems to me to fit a lot of people. They're very spiritual, but they really can't stand a lot of things that have, as she's pointing out, you have to believe a certain thing or you're not religious.
Yeah.
There's a chasm there that I think you've identified. I think it hits a lot of people. And maybe some of those that Debbie's asking us to go out and talk to, they're spiritual, but they don't want to be involved in the little fights.
Well, it's like, it's the Jehovah's Witnesses at the door syndrome. You don't have time for this. I think, I didn't want to kind of leave things where, my comments about religion as a crutch, where I'm speaking now as if I were a secularist theorist. I don't necessarily think that that's the whole story. But it is part of the story. I don't know with Jefferson as much. I mean, Jefferson was very much a man of the modern 18th century. So, he stripped out the superstition from the Bible, and Jefferson, for all of his intellect, I think did not really understand, as we do today, the use of things like metaphor, and we need to be careful about this. I suspect there were a lot of Jews 2,000 years ago who understood that a lot of what was in the Bible was intended more broadly than as the literal truth. Literal truth was perhaps less important to them in some ways. I recall a friend of mine who was an anthropologist working in a small mining village in part of China, where traditional religion, part of Taiwan, where traditional religion was still quite strong. And they had, the gods, and they had shamans and things like this. And as probably some of you know, the folk religions of China have fairly elaborate and specific funeral rites. And he was at a funeral, observing, taking his notes and all the rest of this. This guy's a language freak, and he spoke good Taiwanese, which is one of the more difficult of all Chinese dialects, a few of which are easy. And he was talking about these coal mines. Now, this was a coal mine where we're not talking about an industrial kind of coal mine. He was actually going to go down and go into the coal mine because he's studying miners, and they wouldn't let him do it because, no, it's too miserable, it's too hot, it's too dangerous. They would not let him do it. They were like digging holes in the ground, propping them up with chunks of wood and hoping for the best to get the coal out. Most of them were illiterate or semi-literate. So he's talking to one of these miners, and the miners there, it was a relatively young girl who had died, they were having the funeral rite, and the miner said to him, and he said this was like, because his whole thesis was the folk religions of Taiwan. The miner said, none of this really matters for the person who's dead. We're doing this for us. Now, that's, okay, you might have modern sociological insight, but this is an illiterate coal miner in a village in Taiwan. I think people understood at some level, have generally understood. And I think you got to figure that the priests understood. You can say that the priests who were doing some of the tricks that were done, like at the Delphic Oracle, take an example. Some of those priests might have just been purely cynical, as some modern televangelists are, in my opinion. I've got a pretty thing going here, and so I'm just going to, play this game, and it's going to. But I think there were other priests who would say, well, again, go back to my friend. He had a shaman. Now, I don't know if he was technically a shaman is one particular kind. A shaman is someone whom the god has chosen to speak through. And if the god isn't speaking through you, you're not really anything in particular otherwise. It isn't quite the same thing as years of study and you become a priest, at least in this kind of folk religion. Some god would say, all right, Stephanie, you. And you would go into a trance. And when you spoke in that trance, it is the god speaking. And that's what a shaman is. It is a vessel for the god. And in a lot of folk religions where there are shamans, they don't think of shamans as being particularly great people when they're not being possessed. So there was a very well-known shaman that my friend was speaking to. And he was trying to get some information on it. And the guy told him, he said, listen, Steve, he said, you need to understand something. Sometimes I don't know what happens. Sometimes I am possessed. I do not know what happens. Other times it doesn't work. But those people need something. And so I fake it to give it to them. I mean, that's essentially what he said. So to me, what that says is that even priests who know that there's some trickery, understand that they have a role here. You know, which is, it's like the Catholic doctrine that a Catholic priest may be a bad person, but in his priestly duties, he is nonetheless effective. The last rites administered by a child molesting, violent Catholic priest are still the last rites. Now that isn't how I look at religion. To me that strays towards the superstition side. But the interesting thing to me about a Catholic doctrine is the priest is God's tool in that moment, and it doesn't matter what the priest is like. He's God's tool in that moment. I think there is that element in most religions that can be easily dismissed by secularists. And it's part of what I think comes back to when you talk about human beings being meaning-seeking beings. Which still leaves us with a question, and it's now 10:49, so that still leaves us with a question of, if you're not going to build that around a framework of a force greater than you, then how are you going to, what's the secularist answer to that need for deeper meaning? I mean, maybe it's this get together on Sunday morning.
Ethics.
We'll see who takes off.
There's probably more to discuss here, but
Thank you.
now I will try to get the word out one way or another.
I know my role, may I?
Thank you so much.